The Meiji Restoration, Meiji Ishin, was a huge event in Japan's economic history. It marked the end of the Tokugawa shogunate and brought back the emperor's rule. This time of big economic change went from 1868 to 1912. During this period, Japan grew fast, became modern, and adopted many Western ways. It became a world power in just 50 years. This quick economic change is worth studying, and that's exactly what we'll do in this video. Not many changes, not many political fixes are as important as the Meiji Restoration. It was a time of huge economic shifts that pushed the country into modern times. This event didn't just change how the country was run, it also changed how it was seen in the world as an economic power. In 1868, the old feudal system led by the Tokugawa shogunate ended. This made way for a new time under Emperor Meiji. Meiji means enlightened. This change wasn't just about who was in charge. It was a huge shift that touched every part of life in Japan, from how the country was run and its money to its people and culture. Getting rid of feudalism was the base of it all. Bringing in new technology, making things like roads and buildings better, and opening up to trade with other countries were just some of the many changes made. To understand how big this change was, we first need to look at what feudal Japan was like. It was a strict and layered world with its own special features that made it different from European feudalism. This system shaped people's lives for hundreds of years. Only then can we truly see how deep and wide the changes of the Meiji Restoration were. Here's a quick look at its main parts. Social and political structure. The shogun, who was the military leader, held the real power. The emperor, even though people saw him as a god, didn't have much political power. His job was more about ceremonies and religion, while the shogun made the big decisions for the country. The Tokugawa shogunate was the last and most powerful time of Japanese feudalism, lasting over 200 years. This time, known as the Edo period, was a time of mostly peace, but also when Japan kept itself separate from the rest of the world. The emperor was just for show. He didn't have much real power. Below the shogun were the daimyo. These were feudal lords who ruled their own lands, huge areas of land, with a lot of freedom. The daimyo were powerful and rich feudal lords, all thanks to the hard work of the farmers. Sad but true. They gave land rights to the samurai, so there were many of them. So, the daimyo commanded armies of samurai warriors. These powerful warriors were always fighting for power and influence, and they lived in fancy castles. The samurai had a special place in feudal Japan. They were skilled fighters, but also smart people and good managers for the daimyo, because they also had to collect taxes from the farmers. The samurai served the daimyo and the shogun. These noble warriors followed a strict code of honor called Bushido, which guided how they acted in both war and peace. Bushido stressed being loyal, good at fighting, and having honor, even to death. They lived and died by their rules. At the bottom of the social ladder were the farmers. They made up most of the people. The farmers worked the land and were the ones who truly made the money. We need to really focus on this. The lives of farmers during Japan's feudal period, which went from the 12th century to the mid-19th century, had some very clear features. In this layered social system, farmers were under the rule of the samurai and the feudal lords, daimyo. They had to pay heavy taxes that left them with barely enough to live on. If they got sick, they just died. They had little chance to move up in society and few rights. Farming was how they lived, and growing rice was key. They worked long days, hard work that started before the sun came up, long hours in the fields, dealing with tough weather and simple tools. Their sacrifice and work kept the whole social system going, because they had to give a big part of their crops, up to 70% of what they grew, as taxes to the daimyo. Also, they had to do public work, like planting trees, building, and keeping roads and canals in good shape. They lived in farming villages, where working together and feeling like a community were very important. They had little personal freedom. The show Oshin can help you understand what life was like under the landlords. They had to follow strict rules and laws set by the feudal lords. But there were people like executioners, prostitutes, or beggars who were even lower than the farmers. In short, the lives of farmers in feudal Japan were lives of constant hard work, being dependent and limited, but also of community and deep-rooted traditions. This feudal system shaped Japan for hundreds of years. It brought stability, but it also caused a lot of sadness, tears, and pain, as well as much anger and unhappiness among the lower classes toward those who held power over them. Change was coming. The arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy in 1853 would upset this delicate balance. The arrival of the black ships forced Japan to open up to international trade, which showed how weak the shogunate was. This embarrassing defeat by just a few ships made some daimyos and many samurai unhappy with the Tokugawa shogunate. After such an easy defeat, it became urgent to modernize Japan. So, to fight off Western influence and make sure an independent Japan would exist, the Meiji Restoration was started. The Meiji Restoration marked the end of feudalism in Japan and the beginning of the country's fast modernization and westernization. Key parts of the Meiji reform. The feudal economic system was ended, freeing peasants and allowing people to move up in society. Before, 70% of what a peasant produced went to their landowners. But under the excuse of economic modernization, the state was able to take the resources collected by the daimyos and send them to the state. So, ending feudalism wasn't done to free people from their oppressors, but for more selfish reasons. Feudalism was ended so the state could collect more money. However, the Meiji Restoration changed Japan from a closed-off feudal society into a modern industrial power. In just 50 years, Japan became a military and colonial power in Asia. So much so that it allowed Japan to take part in World War II. In short, the Meiji reform was a time of big and fast changes that reshaped Japanese society and started its rise as a world power. How did the process of ending feudalism happen? How did peasants get access to land? Apparently, it was a complicated process because there were several land reforms. Here are the most important things about how feudalism was abolished and how peasants got access to land during this time. Ending the feudal system. The feudal system, which had been in place for centuries, was ended in 1871, just 4 years after the emperor was put back in power. This meant that peasants were no longer tied to the land and could buy and sell property freely. Then, 2 years later, the land tax reform of 1873, based on the value of the land rather than what was grown. Even though it was only 3% of the land's value, it was enough to make peasants want to grow more on their land, because they would now directly benefit from any increase in what they produced. This reform was a key part of paying for the Meiji modernization. Even back then, they were trying to set up a stable and modern tax system. This land tax system, even though it was basic, allowed the government to have a steady flow of money to pay for Japan's modernization. They gave out land bonds to the old feudal lords to make up for them losing their land, encouraging private ownership. The government actively pushed for peasants to own their own land. Farm loan programs were set up to help peasants buy their own land. As you can see, the Meiji-era land reforms, though basic, had a big impact on Japanese farming and the lives of peasants. The new tax system and the push for private ownership made peasants want to invest in making their land better and using new farming methods, which led to a big increase in what they produced. The peasants, by owning their land and directly benefiting from their work, the economic situation of many of them got much better. One thing to consider against it: the feudal system was ended, but the Meiji way of thinking couldn't grasp land ownership, so the land market is still active today. And that's the source of another big problem: real estate speculation. Even so, the land reforms laid the groundwork for modernizing Japanese farming, which became a key part of its economic growth. The reform also allowed peasants to sell their crops directly, which helped local trade. The Meiji reform also pushed for farming to become modern, with new technologies and ways of growing crops being brought in. These changes made farming more productive, but they also needed money to be invested that some peasants couldn't afford. In short, the Meiji reform totally changed land ownership in Japan, letting many peasants own land. But because of gaps in how land ownership was managed, it created new unfairness and economic problems that are still around today. Now let's talk about this new land tax. During the Meiji reform, a basic tax on land value was put in place. Because there was no set way to do it, it went through big changes, and it's important to understand how it developed. In the old feudal system, the tax was based on the harvest. It was like a punishment for producing. Key features. Collecting this tax was the basic foundation of Japan's economic growth, because it gave the government a steady source of money while also encouraging private land ownership, but for productive purposes. Even with their struggles, the peasants built a strong sense of community. They relied on each other for support. Of course, they had to pay a land tax to the state, but it was much better than in the feudal era where they had to pay over 70% of what they produced to the landowners. They shared the little they had. They celebrated holidays together. They honored old traditions. The peasants were the backbone of Japan. They kept the country going despite the unfairness of the feudal system. So, how did the feudal system fall apart? Commodore Perry and his black ships showed how weak Japan was compared to the West. Perry demanded that Japan open its ports for trade, he threatened to use military force if they said no. The shogunate, which was weak from being corrupt and not doing a good job, had to give in. This caused a lot of people to feel angry at the government. Many Japanese felt embarrassed by how weak the shogunate was. They wanted the emperor to be in charge again. They believed he could make Japan strong and respected again. At the same time, the farmers, who had to pay high taxes and were struggling with a bad economy, were getting more and more restless. They were getting ideas from the growing calls for change. They saw a chance to make their lives better. Everything was ready for a big change. The old way of doing things was about to be swept away. In 1868, a group of young samurai, unhappy with how the shogun was handling foreign affairs, staged a coup. They overthrew the shogunate and brought Emperor Meiji back to power. This event kicked off the Meiji Restoration, a time of huge change in Japan. The Meiji leaders were set on making Japan modern. They wanted to make the country strong. They wanted to avoid being taken over by Western countries. So they started a big plan of changes. These changes touched every part of Japanese society. The Meiji government got rid of the old feudal system. They took away the land and power from the daimyos. They created a modern central government. They set up a constitutional monarchy, like the one in Prussia. They started schooling for everyone and an army where people had to join. Japan was quickly turning into a modern country. Part 5. A global power. Japan's place on the world stage. The Meiji Restoration changed Japan from a feudal backwater to a modern, industrial country in just 50 years. It became a major military and economic power. It showed its strength in East Asia by beating Russia. It joined the ranks of the world's great powers. Japan's success did come with a cost. Fast modernization led to social problems and inequality. It also fueled Japanese imperialism. Japan wanted to spread its influence in Asia. It took over Korea and Taiwan. It fought a series of wars in China. Japan's imperial plans would eventually lead to its defeat in World War II, but the legacy of the Meiji Restoration lived on. Japan rose from the ashes of war as an economic powerhouse. It played a major role in the world economy. Section 9. The Legacy of Meiji. Echoes of the Restoration in Modern Japan. The Meiji Restoration was a very important event in Japan's economic history. It marked the end of feudalism. It started a time of fast modernization and industrial growth. It turned Japan into a major world power. The legacy of the Meiji Restoration is still felt today. Japan's dedication to education, technology, and new ideas started back then. The Meiji Constitution, which was put in place in 1889, laid the groundwork for Japan's modern political system. The Meiji Restoration also left behind some tougher issues. Japan's desire for an empire and its focus on military power led to terrible outcomes. But the lessons from the past haven't been forgotten. After the war, Japan gave up fighting. It chose peace and working with other countries. It has become a great example of a global citizen. The Meiji Restoration, with all its tricky parts and disagreements, still shapes Japan today. From everything we've learned about the Meiji reform, we can conclude that to have a strong country and people who are doing well, we need a tax on the pure value of land. This tax should be enough to stop land speculation. This is a modern idea and not something directly taught by the Meiji reform itself. Even though the land tax reform was a key part of Japan becoming modern and getting rid of feudalism, its main goal wasn't specifically to stop the value created by land speculation in the way we think of it today. The Meiji reform aimed to put power back in the emperor's hands and break down the old feudal system of the Tokugawa shogunate. This meant getting rid of the feudal domains, Han, and setting up prefectures controlled by the central government. So, the daimyos, feudal lords, lost their political and military power. The land tax was meant to create a modern tax system and help pay for the new central government. The tax was set at 3% of the estimated value of the land, and it had to be paid in money, not goods. The person listed as the owner of the land became responsible for paying the tax, and was the only legal owner of that land. We need to really point this out for good management of legal and tax rights for land ownership. Land taxes, like property tax or housing tax, are usually the responsibility of the registered owner. This is because the tax is directly tied to owning the property and its value. The land registry usually names one or more people as the legal owners. If the registered owner is the only name on the property title, then they are the only legal owner of that land. In short, the process of registering property clearly shows who the legal owner is, and because of that, who is responsible for the money duties that come with that property, like paying taxes. It's important to note that there might be special situations or legal complexities, like life estates, trusts, etc. That could affect who pays taxes or who owns the property in some ways, but the general rule is what we just talked about. Main goals of the land tax reform. From the Meiji reform, we learned that to get rid of the feudal system, it was necessary to completely change the political, social, and economic structure. This included a new land tax system that would make the central government stronger and establish private property. While the land tax was based on value, the idea of using it specifically to fight land speculation in the modern sense wasn't the main goal of this reform. This is more of a current idea about how a land tax could be used to solve today's economic problems. In a world where land speculation is the only model we have, if we've gotten rid of feudalism, not getting rid of land speculation means leaving the core of feudalism alive. This highlights a key point about how economic power can stick around even after formal changes or revolutions. Let's break it down. Getting rid of feudalism, a system based on land ownership and a chain of command, without dealing with land speculation, leaves the core of feudal control untouched. This is because land speculation allows individuals or groups to control access to a basic resource, land, and make money from it without necessarily making it more productive. Why can land speculation act like feudalism? Just as feudal lords controlled the land needed for survival and production, land speculators control access to this vital resource, which is needed for everything: housing, farming, industry, creating jobs, and much more. This control gives them a big advantage. Taking money that wasn't earned, rent-seeking, feudal lords took wealth, labor, goods from those who worked the land. Similarly, land speculators can profit from the increase in land value due to public investments, population growth, and other social factors, without necessarily improving the land itself. This is often seen as a form of rent-seeking. Both systems can lead to big differences in wealth and power, with a class of landowners, speculators, benefiting much more than those who need access to land to live. High land prices due to speculation can create big problems for new businesses, farmers, and people looking for homes. This is like how feudal land ownership limited opportunities for those who weren't born into a privileged family. But the Meiji reform's tax on land value, based on its ability to produce, is a great solution to current problems. If all empty land were taxed as if it were built on, whether it's used or not, it would make holding land for speculation less appealing. This is because the owner would still have a tax bill based on the land's potential. By taxing the potential to produce, owners are encouraged to use the land well or sell it to someone who will. This can lead to better use of land and more active economic growth. The value created by the people themselves is returned to the people. The value of land is greatly affected by public investments, like roads and services and community growth. A tax on the pure value of land can bring back all of this publicly created value for the public's benefit. The new tax money could potentially get rid of all other harmful taxes. A single tax on the pure value of land, done well, could replace or reduce other taxes, like income tax, sales tax, or savings tax, which can discourage productive activities. In conclusion, by studying the Meiji reforms, we've correctly found a crucial link between controlling land and the possibility of economic power staying strong, even without formal feudal structures. Land speculation can, in fact, keep some of the main problems linked to feudalism going. The solution you're suggesting, a tax on land value based on its ability to produce, is an effective and powerful way to get rid of land speculation and encourage fairer and more efficient use of land. Its goal is to shift the tax burden from people's productive activities to the pure value of land, potentially weakening the essence of feudalism that still exists today in the form of uncontrolled land speculation. We need to act fast because the disasters of land speculation are getting worse by the hour. Join the fight by sharing this video or talking about it. We have nothing to lose but a whole world to get back. To be continued in another video.